Welcome everyone to the Institute for Ethics in AI here at Oxford University. And we're very privileged to host a discussion today with three wonderful panelists, and especially our guest speaker, Eric Schmidt, who's the former CEO and executive chair of Google. He's the chair of the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, which produced its final report in March this year. Our other panelists are James Manyika, who was the chairman and director of the McKinsey Global Initiative. He's currently a visiting fellow at All Souls College, having previously studied at Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar and held a fellowship at Balliol College. And our third panelist is Carina Prunkl. She's a research fellow at Oxford's Institute for Ethics in AI and a junior research fellow at Jesus College, Oxford. And my name is John Tasioulas. I'm the director of the Institute for Ethics in AI. So perhaps I can begin, Eric, by talking about this important report of which you were one of the lead authors. And the report is framed within a national security context, and it describes a situation of geopolitical competition that America is in and that you believe America may be losing with respect to AI. And if it does lose, then it'll be more than a generation, perhaps, until it recovers its position. I wondered if you could just say something about the main takeaways of that report, perhaps briefly, to put us all in focus. And one particular point that interests me, and that is what we might call the Nietzschean problem. Nietzsche says, when you fight monsters, you've got to be careful not to become a monster yourself. When democracies are in competition with authoritarian regimes, there's a danger of losing your own democratic soul and reduced down to a level that is equally democratic, non-democratic. And then the point is, well, we've actually perhaps won in some sense, but we've lost our own identity. Whether that was something you grappled with and what you think about that particular issue.
Well, thank you, John, and thank you for allowing me to be part of the Institute today. 3 years ago, the U.S. Congress created a commission of which I was the chairman to study the questions of national security and artificial intelligence. And we produced a 751-page report, which you can see online at nscai.gov. In that report, we considered a lot of questions, but it ultimately revolved around the competition of both technology, business, and values with China. And as you know, China has made a very high priority goal of leadership in AI. There's one memo that says that they'd like to dominate by the year 2030. They are now producing more PhDs. They're producing as many or more highly cited papers in AI as the West. So there's every reason to think that there's a new arrival on the stage. Our report concluded that the West was a little bit ahead, but that China was catching up, and I continue to believe that. And the report calls for many, many things, including a typical sort of government report. Lots of money for research, lots of money for hiring some new people, because a lot of people don't understand this stuff. We need new people to understand what's going to go on. The importance of partnerships with both the private sector and with other countries, and values. And as you pointed out, values are key here, because what we say is that there are global platforms getting built, and we do not want those global platforms to reflect non-democratic values. And the easiest way to understand that is, imagine that the internet was built using the Chinese rules and the Chinese laws. How would you feel about your personal privacy, government snooping, all those sorts of things that are so dear to us in the democratic world? Now, what happens in the West is that we spend a great deal of time fighting against each other over relatively small things, right? Small differences in privacy rules or free speech rules or so forth. But we are completely united in our notion of individual freedom, the notion of democracy, the notion of an individual vote, the notion of proportional and direct representation, all of which could be called into question by a Chinese win. With respect to your question about, do we have to give something up in order to compete? We don't think so. We think that the technology and the research that's ahead of us will allow us to maintain leadership in AI without giving up our core fundamental values.
Great. So I think James wanted to talk about this geopolitical competition aspect, and Carina about the cooperation amongst Western nations. So James, perhaps you could start us off.
Yeah, thank you, John. I guess, Eric, I was intrigued by the fact that as you were leading this commission, you also were writing a book with Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocker. which centers on these questions about how AI intersects with, if you like, world order and competition. I'm curious, what was the impetus for writing that book? And it's an interesting collaboration between you, Dan, and Henry Kissinger. Can you say something about that?
Well, an interesting story is that Dr. Kissinger was at a conference and he came across a speaker, Demis Hassabis, who many of us know, who spoke about the potential for AI. And Kissinger, when he was an undergraduate, had done his undergraduate studies on Kant. And he was very interested in the concept and the history of the Reformation and the Age of Reason. And he concluded after this relatively little set of information that there was a possibility that this technology was much bigger than we think of it because of its impact on human society. And a long time later, out comes our book, which comes out in the next few days, called The Age of AI. I have a copy here. And what we say in the book is that artificial intelligence is more than just a technology to make medicine better. It's more than a technology to fight wars better. It's a technology that will change human experience. Because we as humans have never had a human-like intelligence that is a competitor that's not human to contend with. And the book is a discussion of the implications of having that around us.
And one of the things that was striking about that, though, is, and I'm just curious how this compares in your mind. I mean, when you think about world order and technologies that change world order, you think about nuclear weapons, you think about nuclear science and so forth. Is there something materially different about these technologies versus other technologies that have an impact on kind of world order?
Because these technologies are global scale, they can allow a small group to have a huge impact. You see that today in the tech industry, which is dominated by American firms and Chinese firms. And the domination by the sum of those firms has not made a lot of room for technology firms in smaller countries, for example. It's a global platform. So that's an example of an impact. And when an American firm or a Chinese firm takes over a global platform, it also imposes its values and its rules on that platform, much to the frustration of the other country, who then tries to regulate or condemn or what have you, whatever they dislike. So we've seen that in a small scale. With AI, this will become much more profound because AI is capable of doing individual targeting on a per-person basis and can literally drive you crazy with personalization. One metaphor for you is that when I was growing up, I had music and the songs were in an order and that was called a recording and a record. Today you have a playlist. Well, imagine a world where all of your information space is a playlist that is composed for you by someone. Who gets to compose that? Who gets to set your truth? Who gets to set your reality and your reaction? Furthermore, these systems are organized around objective functions, and we talk about this in the book at some length. And setting the objective function determines a lot of the outcome. So if you look at social media, objective function of social media is to make money. To make money, you have to have more engagement. To have more engagement, you have more outrage. Therefore, you have more outrage. It's as easy as that.
Can I pick up this question about setting the function? Because often people conceive of ethics as a series of constraints on achieving your goals. So you mustn't violate privacy in achieving your goals, or you must respect people's rights in achieving your goals. But ethics is equally about setting goals and determining whether something is a worthwhile goal. And it could be that some goals, like manipulating people in order to exercise control of them, is not a worthwhile goal. So let me ask you about the thought that if AI is fully to realize its potential, it has to be geared towards valuable objectives and deployed in ways that are ethically sound. So as an example, because I think it fits into this discussion about the geopolitical context, you'll be aware of the letter in 2015 that was written by a number of AI and robotics researchers on autonomous weapon systems. And this is a quotation from that letter. They said, "The key question for humanity today is whether to start a global AI arms race or to prevent it from starting." And part of their thought here is this is especially acute in the context of AI because AI-enabled weapon systems could often be sort of developed without the use of expensive raw materials. They could become ubiquitous, they could become very cheap, they could fall into the hands of terrorists and dictators. And then they raised the question that beyond all that, there's this issue of tarnishing the field of AI, that a lot of people who work in AI, and I've met some wonderful young scientists, they're also very idealistic and have strong ethical values. Now, if they come to associate, or AI comes to be associated with purposes like surveillance or purposes like warfare, one of the objectives that you've talked about, which is getting the very best people into the field, won't be realized.
Part of the conundrum for AI ethicists is that there's a benefit to this technology that's undeniable.
Yep.
Drug discovery, health, population planning, business planning, and so forth. We're fundamentally going to be a much better, safer, and fairer, in my view, society because of the way AI will roll out. In order to achieve this very rapid Cambrian explosion of technology, we use open source. And by definition, open source is publishing your software so people you don't like can misuse it.
Yep.
By definition. I mean, when we built the internet, which I was part of, we didn't assume nor invite criminals, and yet they showed up. It's like the telephone was invented, and when they invented it, they didn't say, oh, by the way, we're going to allow people to use the phone to do crimes. It just happened.
Yep.
And so we should not be so naive to think that our technology will be kept in a bubble of goodness, right? That it will either be stolen or we will leak it ourselves in the form of open source and it will get misused. Today, the surveillance leadership is clearly in China. They are generations ahead of us. Mm-hmm. And that's clearly a violation of the rules that we collectively have signed. What would you propose to do about it, right? It's a national priority for the country. They have the resources to do it. They took the open source and then they built on and they extended it.
Yeah. But doesn't that
It's a moral question. Yeah. And the problem here is that to go back and stop that, you have to decide, one, we won't do open source. Two, we won't allow this technology to leak. And you end up in a situation where you have military research centers, which is probably not the right outcome.
But I guess the question might be, do you think there is an incentive on the part of China to avoid an AI arms race? And that we should be sort of exploiting that to get some kind of agreement and moratorium on certain areas of research?
I strongly believe, and our book says, that the governments need to start now to discuss the extremely bad uses of these technologies. I think the most obvious extremely bad use is essentially launch on warning, where the AI system looks at the system in front of it and makes the decision to launch an attack, in particular, a nuclear attack. So our report, for example, calls for all the governments of the world to announce that automatic launch of nuclear weapons is a bad idea. This seems like a pretty straightforward decision. How could you possibly justify the killing of 1 million people based on an imprecise, dynamic learning system?
Yes.
One of the problems with AI is people think that AI is more accurate than humans. It is not necessarily. That its judgment is better, not necessarily. And also we understand the human failings of judgment, but we don't understand the universal failings of AI judgment. So we like to think of the AI systems as imprecise, dynamic, emergent, and learning. So you shouldn't make life-critical decisions with systems that are that imprecise at the moment. Maybe in the future they'll be, but not for a long time.
Great. So that is a norm that you're saying potentially could be universal buy-in, but you've also mentioned the possibility of quite a strong consensus among democratic states. Carina, do you want to pick up that point about cooperation amongst democratic states?
Yes, actually, but I would like to expand the discussion not only on cooperation amongst democratic states, but also on global cooperation. So one thing I noticed in your report, Eric, was that it was very much focused on geopolitical competition. And so I think it risks setting up the stage, in a sense, it's us against them. And I think actually maybe, given that we're facing global challenges as a world, we're facing climate change, and we have to find ways to tackle these challenges, whether it's not lacking this perspective of cooperation. So I think there is a huge opportunity for dialogue with other nations who are also developing AI, in particular China. And when we look at the values, as you pointed out, they are quite different, and like the way they are, the way China operates is quite different from our Western democracy. But there are also commonalities, I think, that are worth exploring. And in particular, China's AI report a couple of years ago was emphasizing very Western notions almost of AI ethics, such as privacy, dignity, freedom, autonomy. And I guess it's very tempting to say, well, but these don't really match our notions of privacy, autonomy, dignity, and so on. But you could also think this is a great opening for dialogue and maybe exploring commonalities rather than just focusing on the differences.
We, in fact, agree with everything you just said, and we call for such conversations. Part of the emphasis on China is because China is a new player. In all my career, basically people have treated China as though they were a very good, somewhat backward, well-meaning, very populous country. Today, China is an industrial powerhouse. It is a software and research powerhouse. Their value systems and rules and governance are different from the West, and we have to treat them with respect, but also understand that we cannot have a Western-only conversation. So the ideal scenario would be we would have the equivalent of a conference where we would agree on what are the worst concerns for everyone, which I would argue start with launch on warning, but I'm sure there are others. And we would also hopefully find that we agree on some things like privacy. I note with some interest that China has introduced a GDPR-like equivalent law that's effective essentially next week. China has now announced an intent to restrict algorithms in a way that I cannot explain, and maybe it's not fully described yet in their own documents. So there's every reason to think that China is grappling with its version of the same problems we grapple with, and that's a good sign.
Right, and there's also a lot of international cooperation amongst scientists as well. So there are many Chinese scientists are writing joint papers with European, American, Canadian, Australian, and Japanese scientists.
And one of the things that in our report we said is that collaboration among scientists is crucial. And it's crucial not just for global happiness, but also for individual countries' happiness. So we looked, for example, at the proportion of Chinese authors on American papers. And the top papers always had one or two Chinese-born scientists as part of them. So within the United States, there's this argument that somehow these Chinese people should all be banned, and people make all these arguments, which are wrong. And so we wanted to give people the evidence that if you get rid of the Chinese partners, then you will also hurt yourself. So that's, I think, consistent with your question. But to me, the question is, what's it going to take to get real discussions? And let me just review the history. 1945, there was two bombs used in Japan. 1949, Russia demonstrated a similar technology after 4 years. So that's the timing for proliferation. The primary nuclear technology discussions occurred in the 1950s. So does it take a use of a terrible weapon and a response from the other side in order to get people to the table? I hope not, and I'm worried that it will.
Can I ask you something as a matter of interest about China? The Clinton administration allowed China into the sort of Western economic system. Partly this was premised on the assumption that by being enmeshed with us economically, they would become more democratic, more liberal. That doesn't seem to have happened. Do you think that was a mistake?
I'm not an expert on that. What I will tell you is that China has been around for as long as you all have, if not longer. It has a long and well-established culture. And if I've learned anything as a techno-optimist wandering around the world, culture determines everything. And so in hindsight, people should have looked at China and said, this country has a proud history. They have, in their view, and they're taught this in school, that the Opium Wars were essentially a loss of pride and a loss of relevance, largely at the hands of the British way back when. That as a result, they're taught that they are coming back within the educational system and within the political system. Their messaging is, you are not going to tell us what to do. So that's not the best scenario to start a negotiation with. but it's something that you can work with.
Okay, so let's go back to the democratic consensus, because you were quite sanguine there about the prospects of real consensus among democratic societies and that they could somehow be a counterbalance against whatever concerns we might have about China. So you say these disagreements about matters such as privacy are quite marginal. But I just wonder what you think, though, about the EU's attempts to regulate AI, and in particular this new regulation that's being propounded.
So my issue with regulation, and as an American executive, I've dealt with Europe now for the majority of my professional career, is that in Europe, the culture is to regulate first and build the product later. And that makes perfect sense. After all, there's this potential harm. We would never want anyone to be subjected to that harm, and we're so smart, we can figure all that out and so forth. The problem with premature regulation is that it cuts out the experimentation and the path that people have to go through to get to a good outcome. A good example is that in Britain 20 years ago, deep linking, which is what Google essentially does, was illegal. And so Google could not have been founded in Britain because it would have been illegal. That law has since been changed. So this bias of regulation first really does prevent innovation. So the correct thing for Europe to do, which they've chosen not to do yet, is to do the same kind of commission that I was fortunate to lead for the United States, which was basically a statement of what are the problems, where are the businesses, and what should the regulations look like. Europe has chosen just the third.
Right.
And in particular, Europe has made the following extremely sensible statement. For things which are critical infrastructure, you cannot use AI unless it can explain what it's doing. Makes perfect sense, right? That eliminates almost all uses of AI in Europe, because AI by itself, by definition, cannot fully explain itself. It's like a teenager. If you have a teenager, ask the teenager to explain what they're doing. And yet we tolerate the presence of teenagers because we know we work it out. And I'm being facetious, but my point about AI is the technology today is of a certain form. It should be used in certain characteristics. The way that Europe has written it, it will have a chilling effect on these key uses. And the result is that the companies that invent the future will not be in Europe, they'll be in Britain, they'll be in the United States, and they'll be in China. This is easily solved by Europe having a regulation and growth plan, which identifies on the growth side where the great companies in Europe can be built. The most obvious one, by the way, is in biology and pharma, because European biology and pharmas are fantastic, right? So why doesn't Europe, instead of focusing on the downside of regulation, focus on the upside of building those industries, getting the smart people, building the human resource? They'd be a much stronger position and do the regulation at a similar time.
But Eric, can you explain a little bit why you see the European approach as inhibiting? Because no doubt they would argue, and we had a very impressive representative from the European Union yesterday arguing, that they are trying to foster innovation, but in the context where some of the grosser risks are being mitigated. So what would you point to as, here's a clear example of something that really needlessly stifles innovation?
Well, a good example is the presence of lawyers. So what happens when you have a regulation is nobody wants to violate the law, nobody wants to lose their company, and so forth. So the lawyer, who are by definition paid to be conservative, tend to over-restrict the activities. And furthermore, because the experimentation phase is cut out, you don't have an opportunity to have the learning. Now, if you don't believe me, which is fine, give me examples of innovative companies that have operated and been very successful at the platform level under European regulation. And they don't exist. Okay. And they don't exist because to get to the point where they're at a certain scale, you have to take some kind of risk, some kind of judgments without the presence of these lawyers. And I'm not suggesting that we don't need regulation. I'm just suggesting that the regulation should arrive at the right time, not too early and not too late.
So I want to turn it over to James in a second, because I'm sure you've got something to say about that. But you're making a point here which I think is really quite powerful, which is you can't simply look at a regulation in the abstract. You have to look at the effect that it has on people. And often it will have unintended effects. People becoming excessively cautious, people thinking that they can't really risk making this move because they'll be entangled in litigation.
It's called chilling effect.
Yeah.
And whether you like it or not, a 200-page regulation, which people cannot understand because they're not lawyers, has a chilling effect.
Yeah.
Remember that a lot of the innovation is from young people who don't necessarily fully understand everything. They're not big companies and so forth. Regulation at this level tends to benefit the incumbents.
Right, and those who can afford the expensive lawyers who can make sense of those regulations. James.
Well, I actually wanted to pick up on that point, John, and something you said, Eric, which is somehow a key thing we're going to need to get right is to enable young innovators, young scientists, young people, young entrepreneurs. How do you think about that in the context of kind of platform companies? Because some have argued, for example, that the larger company can often sometimes stifle innovation. How do we encourage either the smaller companies, the individuals, to be part of the story? What would you say to young people, for example, about this is how you get started, this is how you become part of this AI story?
Well,
at a time when, as we know, things like compute make a big difference in AI development and its deployment. We know that access to data makes a big difference. How do we encourage young companies and young individuals?
So we have a set of proposals to address that, but I'd like to address this belief somehow that the big companies are stifling innovation head on. Right. The biggest companies in the world are tech companies with the highest valuations. The amount of money in terms of the number of unicorns, so-called billion-dollar companies, is enormous now. The path to valuation for small tech companies starts at $100 million, $1 billion valuations. So there's not a lack of money, there's not a lack of innovation, and there's not a lack of people trying. That's just false. Now, we want to help there be lots of innovation and lots of competitors. And in our report, we suggest something which Stanford also pushed very hard, and I think you were part of this, something called the National Research Network. The idea is that the big companies have the computing facilities to do their research, but if you're a researcher or a small company, you don't have access to that. And I strongly agree with that. And by the way, it's not just the hardware, it's also access to the data. The way AI systems work today, anyway, is that they are driven by what they can learn. And at least at the moment, there's pretty much great returns to more data. More data, better, more data, better, more data, better. And that tends to help larger institutions. We need to address that. It's important to note, by the way, that this increasing returns to data, there is a limit to that. And furthermore, there's a lot of research in AI now to try to do learning on less data to address this issue.
Yeah, and in fact, one of the things I know you spent a lot of time doing is you spend a lot of time with young companies, entrepreneurs, scientists, and universities and companies and so forth. As you look ahead, Eric, and and I know you've thought a lot about this, what are the things we have to get right if we're going to be wonderfully happy about the outcomes in AI? Are there some things you'd say we have to get these things right? And presumably those things are not just the downsides, but also presumably the upsides and the bounty and flourishing that can come out of using AI systems.
So let's assume that the eventual goal here is systems that are human-like intelligence that help us have a great life as humans, right? So it's an all positive scenario. So developing those kinds of systems, which start with savants and people who help you and personal assistants, should be guided by some principles. And the first principle is sort of the do no harm principle, the obvious one from doctors. And I think developing that sort of principle across the research enterprise and the businesses is good. There's lots of evidence, for example, now that social media has had some harm, right? And the first step in any problem is to recognize it's occurred, try to figure out how you would address it. We already know, for example, that when you train an AI system based on language, it develops huge prejudice because the language has prejudice. Sometimes the languages have prejudice because of omission. So there are underrepresented groups in the thing. But the other thing is sometimes there are just people who are just not desirable in the population. And there's a great deal of research about how to address that. The consensus among the scientists in AI is that problem will get solved. So we may be able to say that within some reasonable design principle, we can train intelligent systems that don't have all that downside and they have a lot of upside. And that's the goal.
Eric, could I pick you up on something you said earlier about the right moment for regulation. You said
Yeah.
it shouldn't be too early and it shouldn't be too late. And I'm sure there is disagreement about when is the right time. But just looking back at what has been happening in the last decades, it seems that in some cases, we are too late with the regulation. So I'm thinking about the GDPR, where the GDPR was trying to do something almost impossible by putting some rules on the storage and of personal data, and we could see how already the system was so entrenched. I mean, the data economy was so entrenched in the entire in the system that the GDPR had a very, very hard time, and in some cases also didn't succeed entirely to do what it was put out to do, basically. So right. So just to come back to this to the EU regulation, where as John said, we had an interesting discussion about it yesterday, and I should also mention. It is a draft, so it is subject to debate, and it will be changing a lot. But is it not better to start talking and thinking about these issues now rather than later, before everything is so deeply entrenched that we can actually not change anything anymore?
So I'm completely in agreement that we should have these debates. And indeed, pretty much every business I know and every government has an AI ethics document which it claims to follow. Even China has an AI ethics rule, and the US military has an AI ethics rule, and I know because I helped write it. So you have, and the sum of them have similar words but different implementations. That's the way to understand it. So that's a good thing. The problem on the European side is that even the draft is a chilling effect, because it doesn't say that one of the goals is to build huge wealth impact from a European perspective. So the consequence of the strategy that they've identified is that it entrenches or benefits non-European companies, because they'll still be working hard while the Europeans are still trying to figure out what they can do. So the chilling effect occurs from the moment you issue the draft, and I appreciate that the draft can be changed, but the time during this period is lost, while the people not subject to that are still subject to it. Another example, GDPR. GDPR is hailed by many Europeans as one of their greatest achievements. It's a regulatory achievement. The benefit of GDPR largely went to the incumbent American companies. It does not appear to have created a huge number of new European startups and so forth that are flourishing and so forth. Maybe that will change in the future, but I don't think so.
Right, the primary goal is to protect the citizens.
Yes, to protect the citizens from those evil companies.
No, it doesn't have to be evil companies. So the thought is, presumably there are multiple values we need to keep in balance. There are many economically valuable activities one might engage in that are outlawed because we think they're incompatible with our values. So what if the European game is as follows, that there's a recognition that the citizenry wants certain kinds of protection, even if it comes at an economic cost. Now, it's not suicidal, because the hope is that others will then look at this model and say, well, we want a similar protection in our country as the Europeans are enjoying. And isn't this happening in the States already? Isn't California attracted to something like a GDPR-type regulation?
I don't think there's any evidence that GDPR-type regulation will succeed in the US. And I was making my point about the company, just to be, again, a little bit facetious. But the fact of the matter is, it's fine for a government to restrict activities, no problem whatsoever. There are costs to that restriction.
Absolutely.
The costs of the European regulatory stance is a loss of corporate formation, innovation, and inventing the future. That future will be invented elsewhere. There's nothing wrong with Europe saying we are the regulators and the Americans are the innovators. Just say it.
Yep.
Just be honest about it. Don't lie to yourself that it's going to produce that. The GDPR is not going to produce a lot of innovation, except in the case of trying to adapt to the regulation. If you look at Europe today, which is, again, a fantastic place for humans and society, the primary success has been in basically banking, financial services, delivery services. Those are regulated industries. They tend to be relatively local. So when you create regulation that's local, you then get companies that are coherent with the local regulation. Shouldn't surprise you.
Okay, can I ask you, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on that. So much of this conversation is focused obviously on the US and China. And I'm just curious, Eric, if you were another country or company that was not American or Chinese, or a company that was not in America, what would you advise the head of a government in Europe or the head of a government in the global South to do in light of AI? What would you advise the founder or CEO of a company in Europe, or the founder or CEO of a company in Brazil, to do about AI?
So in Europe, we need a great deal more funding for AI research. I have since learned that that is largely controlled at the Brussels level. And so that's a Brussels initiative. And Europe is always complaining it doesn't have enough money because there's plenty of goals. This should be an important one. With respect to countries that are not European, not the sort of West that we are defining, the elite West, the best thing that they can do is to focus on an aspect of research where they have either a special need or a special goal and fund it. One of the great concerns I have, to be very clear, is that there will be 12 countries, 15 countries that will dominate this entire space because they have the money, the talent, the correct regulation. So let's list who they might be. South Korea, Japan, maybe India, certainly Britain, maybe France and Germany, certainly Israel, a few other countries like that. Well, what happens to the other 170 countries, right? They're not big enough, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough people that they become vassals of these other countries in something as critical as alternatives to human intelligence and the impact on business, society, national security, innovation, and so forth. So every country should have a strategy for dominance or leadership in AI. We have some countries, an example would be Estonia, which plays above its weight. We have another, Singapore plays above its weight. It's possible for smaller countries, when they get very focused, to do so. There's evidence that the former Soviet bloc countries can play above their rate because a lot of this stuff is incredibly difficult to understand. It's basically math and physics. And because they have a long tradition of math and physics, they have an unfair share, in a good sense of unfair share, of the talent that can master that. So that's a path for them. For the countries that are largely agrarian, not very well run, don't have a center of excellence in universities, where do they go? They missed out on the manufacturing revolution, which is largely now defined by China, and they're going to miss out on the intellectual services and AI because it's dominated by these other countries. It's going to be difficult for them.
If I could follow up on that, I mean, one of the things I think is quite remarkable that you've done is you've tried to focus on talent in many more places besides just the Western world. Say more about how you've thought about that.
Well, what's interesting is that we partnered with Rhodes College, first looking for postdocs in science that were of global talent. And we had such a good partnership that we did a deal with them called RISE. And we just announced our winners this week. Basically, we had 50,000 people compete. We picked 100 winners. Rhodes basically did the human selection down to the 100. And they, of course, are the best in the world at it. And the initial idea was to look for people who are 16 or so and who have unusual skills. There's lots of evidence that people who are 16 we can identify using various techniques, people of extraordinary potential, creative potential, science potential, math potential, what have you. We've just announced our cohort, and we will track them through life. And we will provide them financial support, mentoring support, and so forth. In talking to these gifted people, and you ask them, what's it like to be you? What they say, and one of my words, is that they're lonely, that they feel different from everyone else. And so they need mentors and they need a community to make them feel good about what they're doing, to give them encouragement, and I think it will make a big contribution.
Fantastic. Eric, can I ask you about the book, which of course I haven't read, but I see it enticingly there in your lap. You mentioned Kant. As a philosopher, I feel duty-bound to ask you about Kant. So Kant very much puts at the center of the value of human beings their capacity for rational autonomy. So their ability to stand back from whatever inclination they may happen to have, whatever customs they may find themselves living amongst, and to question whether these inclinations ought to be followed, whether these customs ought to be followed. There is a sense in which, if this is in some sense the locus of human dignity and what distinguishes us from non-human animals who have some reasoning capacities, but not in a way that enables them, a dog, to step back and say, should I adopt a vegetarian diet? That's not an issue. How does AI play into that? Because it looks like for the first time we have a real competitor for decision making, and that humans could end up delegating all sorts of decisions to these automated processes, or we could use forms of technological governance that actually just eliminate the question of human choice. They just rule out certain options as being possible. Do you think that there is an issue from this kind of, let's call it Kantian or human dignity perspective, that in a sense we're kind of abolishing ourselves or what's unique about us by reliance on AI?
So this, of course, is why we wrote the book.
Right.
So one way to understand your field and your view is that there was a point before when people would just do what the king said or what the god said, and that in the Kant model, what happened was people had the notion that they could step back and be critical of something else. And that became the definition of being human. Mm-hmm. So our question is, what does it mean to be human in the future? We understand what it means to be human today. And I'll give you some examples. If you look at history, when human society experienced things that it didn't understand, it would often revolt or it would create a new religion. Is AI going to be so powerful that it will provide new insights that we don't see? And if so, how will we react? There are people who believe that AI can see things that we as humans can't see. Mm-hmm. And they extrapolate from a small amount of data, including the fact that with AlphaGo, which of course was the computer that won the Go championship against the humans, that it invented new moves that had not been seen by humans in 2,500 years. The fact that AI can take chemical compounds and discover on its own their interrelated structure without being told what to do, well, that's curious. That says that there may be some thing that either we don't see or more worrisomely we don't comprehend.
Yep.
So maybe we'll just adapt to that thing over there. It has its own logic, but we keep it in a lockbox, and we ask it a very carefully constrained question because we don't want to ask it an unconstrained question. That's an okay outcome. But I'm more concerned about the impact on daily life. My easiest example is in London, magically every car is self-driving, and the engineers from Google and others have programmed it to perfectly use the streets. So it's perfectly scheduled, a perfect algorithm. And you have a woman who's pregnant and she's got to get to the hospital quicker than everybody else. Is there a button that says, I'm pregnant, I've got to get to the hospital in an emergency, you have to get rid of all of those efficiency rules that are so beautifully designed by you, the engineer, so I can deal with my problem? And this is a metaphor for human freedom. And we are very concerned that these systems, as they permeate our society in little ways, will take away choices, of which that's an example.
Well, that's a beautiful example of the Aristotelian notion of equity, that a rule that is perfectly fine for the general run of cases will always encounter situations where there has to be a departure from that rule. And this has been typically like one of the great prized domains of human judgment, to know when it's appropriate to depart from an otherwise sound rule. So just building a bit on these sorts of Kantian concerns, we talked about putting it in a black box. Do you have a sense in the book, or more generally, that there might be some domains of decision-making that really have to be kept in human hands? And that's, in a sense, irrespective of the outcome.
So in the book, we say that we want to preserve human judgment for these systems which are life-critical, and also where we cannot articulate the moral composition in front of the people. And as you know, as a student of this, that these traditions that we take for granted, whether it's free speech or the way judges work or so forth, have been around for many, many, many years in society precisely because they provide stability. And so you could imagine a situation where a team perfectly planned a human experience, but did it in such a way taking away every aspect of human freedom. That's clearly undesirable. So what we call for in the book is the union of the computer scientists and the philosophers to try to find that boundary. We are concerned in the book that the technical people who are optimizing success, impact, wealth, and so forth are completely ignorant of these trade-offs.
Yep.
And often run at them with what I would describe as my own view, which is the techno-optimist view. And the techno-optimist view runs into the reality of human history and human experience every day.
So let me just pick up on this a little bit, because there is another important book that's just been published called Noise by Kahneman, Sibony, and Sunstein. And one of the things they talk about is not so much bias, where there's a systematic tendency to go wrong in a certain way, but noise, where you have unwanted variability in judgments. And one of the great examples they give is if you're an asylum seeker in the US, there's huge variation in how judges treat applications. So some judges who will accept 88% of applications, others accept, at the other extreme, 5%. Now, the claim here is being made, sure, I take your point, human freedom is very important, but should we value the freedom of judges to be so inconsistent in the decisions they make? Surely in a domain, I'm now sort of playing devil's advocate, but surely in a domain that has life-affecting implications, as this one does, and we're not talking about private individuals, we're talking about officials. Now, their claim is some sort of algorithmic decision-making would eliminate this noise. Mm-hmm. Now, they're very cautious because they understand the politics of it, that probably humans will not surrender that authority. But the thought is, we need to approximate closer to this kind of model. What would you say to that sort of response?
So let's imagine the following scenario. We build a computer system that is uniformly applied to, for example, parole violations
Yes.
or something else like that, which is the typical example. Would it be capable of taking advantage of all of the local variables that exist in the courtroom? Maybe, but it would require an enormous amount of training data. So that's the first problem.
Yep.
So let's say you manage to do that. Well, all of a sudden, there are extenuating circumstances in every case
Sure.
that might not be possible. I'll give you an example that there's a system that scores opioid prescription in the United States. And that system basically says you're giving out too much opioid prescription to your patient. Now, doctors are able to override that. So it's advisory. Sounds great, right? But the effect of it
Yes.
is a chilling effect
like the
on
chilling
giving
effect,
people
yeah.
who need their drugs.
Yes.
Because the doctor says, oh, do I really have to fight that system? And it's just easier, and so they prescribe less, which was not what the system intended. So you want to be very careful with taking human systems and standardizing them, and then assuming that individual freedom will overcome and handle these local cases. The better scenario, by the way, using the example that you described, is to look at the extremes. Mm-hmm. So instead of building an AI system that simply makes the decision, just look at the extremes on one end and the extremes on the other. And what you'll find in any human distribution of freedom, there's a few people who get it wrong all the time, and a few people over here who get it wrong all the time, and police that. And then accept the variance between the ranges, literally throwing out the top 10% and the bottom 10% into the average, and the 10 to 90 points in the distribution, the median is a rational outcome. And that's a better approach. The closer you get to regulation of human behavior, the more likely you are to get a standardized rule, a common place of thought, and a lack of differentiation and deviation. I, for one, believe in human freedom. I do not want these systems to have the chilling effect on me, my creativity, my ability to speak.
That's really interesting. Does anyone want to come in on this point about human dignity and freedom?
No, I think this is exactly right. I would say maybe where we will need to have a more detailed discussion is about what freedoms are worth keeping. So, for example, in the car example, freedom of choice is very important, but you might think that in some cases choice is less important than in other cases. And possibly the car case would be one where if this system could save so many lives and make traffic so much more efficient, maybe that's a way where we could say, okay, we're going to sacrifice our choice of pressing the button and going to the hospital quicker in order to do that. In other areas, as I think you rightly said, like it seems in the case of judge rulings or court rulings, it seems these are areas maybe where we do want to keep our freedom of choice for all cases.
What I would say is that a lot of this depends on the culture in which you're being brought up.
Absolutely, yes.
It's very clear if you look at the Confucian culture in Asia, the notion of individual freedom is different, and the trade-offs are different. And I'm not taking a position on them, but I want them to be in alignment with the way the systems are actually implemented.
All right.
Actually, let me pick up on that, Eric. There's a tension here which is worth exploring. I'd be curious how you think about it. So on the one hand, like you, I like the freedom, our freedom, our choices, and all of that. And as you say, a lot of those end up being very local, somewhat cultural, somewhat, shaped in the political economy you live in some ways, whether it's a democracy or not, and so forth. And yet at the same time, these technologies quickly achieve global scale. And because they are, network technologies and so forth. And so how do we adjudicate those tensions when in fact one system built in one place that may have done a wonderful job reflecting the values and choices of that one place is now deployed at global scale?
So the internet has been facing this for decades.
Right.
And what often happens is a particular country gets upset with another country's company and they ban its global operation. And then the originating country says, no, you can regulate it within your own country, but you can't regulate it in others. And there's one of the sort of basic principles is where do you want to do the regulation? There are people who believe that there are absolute human rights, which means it applies to the whole globe.
Right.
And clearly there are local rights that apply to your city and your town. Those issues are unresolved in our society. And technology has made them clear. My own view is that I'm in favor of free speech for humans. And that does not extend to automated robots, amplifiers, people with microphones, and so forth. You're welcome to say whatever you want, but to then have it be amplified as though it's from a million people is not okay with me. That's my own view.
Right.
We have to find that balance. I want everyone to have their ability to speak, but I also don't want them to have an overwhelming ability over everyone else.
So do you think that, and I'm particularly interested in this, given just the amount of work you've done with Henry Kissinger and others who've seen these things over time, do we need a different set of international institutions? So in other words, because sometimes historically at least, a lot of these questions have been adjudicated with multilateral institutions, whether it's the WTO or the UN or any of these kind of institutions that try to do this on behalf of the whole world. Are those institutions the right one for this next age of AI? Do we need different ones? And if they're different, what do those look like?
I don't think we know, and we don't take a strong position on this. Dr. Kissinger did in the 1950s the nuclear proliferation negotiations, both initially as a research scientist at Harvard, and then later when he was Secretary of State and National Security Advisor with the Soviets. So he has the best understanding, because he did it, of how this worked. And his description of it is pretty straightforward. What he says is, we would sit there and we would say to each other how many missiles we had. And then we would debate over what to do about it and so forth. And I pointed out that the problem here is we don't count missiles in this AI world. In other words, if I invented a technology that was very dangerous, the one thing I would never tell my opponent is about it. Because if I told them about it, then they would be inspired to build it themselves. And so the whole concept of how we do global negotiation, treaties, and so forth has to be rethought. So going back to what you said about philosophy, we don't have a philosophy for how to coexist. We also don't have a diplomacy strategy in the area of software and its proliferation. And I'll give you the extreme case. I'm one of these people who believe, and I guess I'm an optimist in this, that in 20 years or so, we'll have systems that are general intelligence systems. So there are many inventions that have to happen, and we can debate this. It's my belief. When these systems occur, how many will there be? I think maybe more than one, maybe 10. Where will they be? There'll be a few in China, a few in the United States, maybe some in Europe, et cetera. But they're going to be proliferation issues. Because if you can say to a system that's as smart as the smartest human being in the world, how can I kill 1 million people who are not of my race? We can't let that proliferate. That's the same problem as nuclear proliferation. So not only do we need a philosophical view, and not only do we need a regulatory view of how to handle this, but we need a diplomatic view of how to limit the spread, especially in evil hands, of the downsides of these technologies. There's no conversations that I'm aware of this at all.
Well, that is statesmanship, the epitome of human judgment. You need someone who's got those qualities. This has been a fantastic discussion, Eric. Thank you so much for coming to Oxford. We're kind of inspired to go ahead and read your book, and I hope that we might be able to re-invite you at a later stage with Henry Kissinger and Dan Huttenlocher to have a discussion about the book in depth. But I just want to thank you for coming today, and also thank two wonderful commentators, James and Carina. Thank you all so much.
Thank you guys, and thank you all, and thank you all.
Thank you.